On August 13, 2005, a Helios Airways Boeing 737 landed in Larnaca International Airport in Cyprus. After completing a flight from London, Flight 522 then continued to Prague, with a stopover in Athens. The cabin crew reported unusual noises coming from the right rear door during the flight. They recorded in the aircraft's logbook that the seal around the door was freezing and loud bangs could be heard during the flight. In the early morning hours of August 14th, ground engineers went to inspect the reported issue with the door. It was around 1:30 in the morning when they arrived at the parked aircraft. To test whether the door was leaking, they needed to pressurize the aircraft while it was grounded. This required switching the cabin pressurization mode selector from the normal auto position to manual. After completing the tests, they recorded in the maintenance log that they found no fault with the door. However, they made a critical mistake. They forgot to switch the pressurization control back to auto. This single forgotten step would prove catastrophic just hours later. Around 6 a.m., the crew of Helios Airways Flight 522 arrived at the airport. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten was a 58-year-old German pilot with decades of experience and over 16,900 flight hours. First Officer Pampos Karalambous was 51, from Cyprus, and had nearly 7,500 hours of flying experience. The crew was joined by 4 cabin crew members, including 25-year-old Andreas Prodromou. Andreas was not originally scheduled to work that day, but he agreed to join the crew. Prodromou was a steward with pilot training and held a private pilot license, or PPL, but he was not certified to fly a Boeing 737. At around 8:30 a.m., passengers began boarding the Boeing 737. The 115 passengers were mostly Cypriot and Greek families. Many were returning from summer vacations. As the boarding process finished, the pilots went through their pre-flight checks. The second critical mistake happened here. The flight crew did not notice that the pressurization mode selector was still in the manual position. At 9:07 a.m. local time, Flight 522 was cleared for takeoff and was able to depart. As the aircraft climbed, a deadly situation was developing. With the pressurization system in manual mode, the cabin was not pressurizing. This meant as the plane climbed higher, the air inside the cabin was getting thinner and thinner. At 9:12, just 5 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed to an altitude of 12,040 feet, a warning alarm suddenly sounded in the cockpit. This was the cabin altitude warning, alerting the pilots that the cabin wasn't properly pressurized. The captain contacted the Helios Operations Center and informed them that Flight 522 had an active takeoff configuration, instead of identifying the actual cabin pressure. The crew was distracted by the equipment cooling warning lights, which also illuminated on the control panel. These lights were, in fact, a side effect of the decreasing air pressure. The captain then reported to the ground engineer that the cooling system indicator lights were off. The technician suspected that the aircraft had an issue with the cabin pressurization system and directly asked the captain if the pressurization panel was set to automatic mode. However, the captain, who was already experiencing the first signs of hypoxia, did not respond to the question. Instead, he asked about the location of the cooling system circuit breakers. This was the last radio communication with the aircraft. At 9:30 a.m., air traffic controllers in Nicosia tried to contact Flight 22 to hand it over to Athens Air Traffic Control. There was no response, only silence. Controllers tried different frequencies, even asking other aircraft to make contact, but nothing worked. The plane crossed into Greek airspace at 9:37, still maintaining a steady course at 34,000 feet. Athens Air Control took over, continuing the attempts to reach the silent aircraft. For more than 2 hours, Flight 522 continued flying, a ghost plane in the sky. Greek authorities grew deeply concerned as the aircraft continued its course toward the capital. ignoring all attempts at communication. At 11:05, 2 F-16 fighter jets were dispatched from Helios Air Base. Their mission? Intercept the mysterious plane and assess the situation. When they reached Flight 522 at 11:24 a.m., the sight was alarming. The captain's seat was empty, while the first officer appeared to be slumped over the controls. Oxygen masks were hanging in the passenger cabin, painting a grim picture of the situation on board. As the plane reached Athens, it didn't land. Instead, the autopilot followed its programming and entered a holding pattern over the island of Kea, circling at 34,000 feet while waiting for further instructions that would never come. At 11:49 a.m., something unexpected happened. The F-16 pilot observed a person entering the cockpit and taking the captain's seat. According to the description, it was Andreas Prodromou, a 25-year-old flight steward with pilot training. By some miracle, he remained conscious, using one of the portable oxygen bottles stored in the cabin to survive for more than 2 hours in the depressurized aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder captured his desperate distress call, in which he identified the flight and requested assistance. However, no one heard it, as it was still tuned to the frequency of the already distant Larnaca airport. Even worse, the aircraft was now running low on fuel after circling nearly 10 times in a holding pattern. As a result, the left engine failed due to fuel exhaustion, causing the plane to sharply tilt to the left and begin descending. Although Andreas was a trained pilot, he had never flown a 737 and lacked the necessary knowledge to operate such an aircraft. The F-16 pilot attempted to guide Andreas toward the airport, but it was too late. Subsequently, the right engine also failed, and the aircraft began gliding without power. At 12:04 p.m., after nearly 3 hours as a ghost flight, Helios Airways Flight 522 crashed into hills near the village of Grammatico, about 25 miles northeast of Athens.
The Boeing 737 plunged into a hillside 25 miles northeast of Athens, just after noon local time. Helicopters circled overhead all afternoon, dumping water over the burning wreckage to stop brush fires. The plane was flying from Cyprus to Athens. Officials say there had been no radio contact with the aircraft before.
All 121 people on board died in the impact. Autopsies later confirmed that the passengers and crew had been alive at the time of impact, but most were in a deep, non-reversible coma from prolonged exposure to hypoxia. The investigation revealed a chain of errors that led to the tragedy. After maintenance, ground engineers mistakenly left the pressurization switch in the manual position, an error that the pilots overlooked during 3 separate pre-flight checks. When the warning signal sounded, they mistakenly assumed it was a takeoff configuration alert and failed to recognize the real danger. The report concluded, the non-recognition by the pilots that the pressurization system was in the manual mode and the continuation of the climb led to their incapacitation due to hypoxia. After the Helios 522 tragedy, several safety improvements were implemented. Boeing updated its maintenance manuals to specifically state, return the pressurization mode selector to auto. Checklists were revised to make pressurization settings clearer, and better training was developed to help pilots distinguish between different warning sounds. As a result, the FAA issued a directive requiring a visual warning light to alert pilots to cabin pressure issues. The accident also highlighted concerns about cockpit door security following 9/11. While reinforced doors protect against hijackers, they can also prevent crew members from gaining access in an emergency. The crash devastated families across Cyprus and Greece. Whole families were lost, couples traveling together, children returning from vacation. The town of Grammatico built a memorial on the hillside where Flight 522 went down. Each year, family members gather to remember those they lost. Today, the lessons of Helios Flight 522 are taught to pilots around the world. Its legacy lives on in the safety improvements that help protect millions of air travelers every day.